My name is Nick Dunn. I serve as Vice President of Strategy and Communications for the Sutherland Institute, and it's my privilege to host our first panel discussion. So if I can invite our two panelists to come join me on stage. As they get situated, I want to tell you all a little bit about them, because they are both people with incredible resumes and incredible depth and breadth of expertise on these issues. So Elizabeth Clark is the Associate Director for the International Center for Law and Religion Studies here at BYU. She has written over 40 chapters and articles, and also written or co-edited various books. Her expert analysis has been featured in national and international media, including the National Review and SCOTUS blog. She has also testified before the United States Congress, United Nations. She's attended academic conferences all over the world. And she's also drafted analysis of pending legislation that would impact religious freedom in over a dozen countries. In short, Elizabeth knows what she's talking about. Our other guest is Bill Duncan, my colleague at Sutherland Institute, where Bill serves as our Religious Freedom Policy Fellow. Bill has authored 75 scholarly articles that have appeared in some prestigious publications you may have heard of, such as the Rutgers Law Review, the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, Stanford Law and Policy Review, and many more. Bill has submitted briefs on constitutional issues to the United States Supreme Court, to 10 federal courts of appeals, 8 different state Supreme Courts, and he has testified as an expert witness before the legislatures of 7 different states. So if you're a judge or a legislator, there's a good chance you've read something Bill has written or heard him speak. So with these two experts, I want to kind of build on what Judge Griffith just gave us as an excellent framework for how to approach religious freedom issues. And the first question, building off of what he said, we all recognize the divisive time we're in, what feels like a very fractured political and social environment. So the first question is, recognizing that context, help us understand a little bit, why can this issue become so difficult to talk about? Why does it become so controversial? What is it about religion and religious freedom that makes it hard to discuss productively? Elizabeth, if we could start with you.
Sure. I think there's two main things that make this a really divisive topic for many people. One is that there's a lot less interest and affiliation in religion than there used to be. A Gallup poll in 2021 showed that instead of the 70% that had been going on since the 1940s, we're now down to 47% of people in the United States who affiliate and belong to a religious tradition. But I think even more than that, where people really get inflamed and feel threatened is sort of where Judge Griffith was going. This idea that people see it as a harm, right? They see, particularly in the field of sexuality, religious freedom and religious views have often, and not always, but have been seen as opposing people's identity, people's body, people's sense of who they are. And those kind of conflicts can be very difficult and very personal. And so that's where you get a lot of this coming from, where religious freedom is seen as bigotry or is seen as just a way to covertly oppose somebody because of their sexuality.
I agree entirely with these, and I should say I'm just so honored to be with Elizabeth and on the panel, and you too, Nick. But I think an additional thing is there's a lot more that's regulated than there ever has been in the past, and so the opportunity, I've often thought about this, that if you were to set up a soup kitchen, and I don't know that this happened, but in the middle of nowhere in 1875, there weren't a lot of health codes and other things. Those things are mostly good, but the potential for conflict probably is increased as well. And I think maybe I'd add just one other, is that the Supreme Court has changed its the way it approaches protection of religious freedom over time. So that creates a little bit of uncertainty about what exactly will be protected. And I think all of those factors together have created a kind of a perfect storm, maybe. That's probably too strong an analogy for religious freedom right now.
Well, in that context, for our audience here in the room and the audience online watching the live broadcast, we want to kind of equip you all with some information and principles and tools to go out and be defenders of religious freedom, to be advocates for it, but to do so with the approach and framing that Judge Griffith offered us in a way that binds people together, that builds each other up. So with that kind of core objective for our audience today, how can we make the case in favor of religious freedom in this environment? And specifically what you said, Elizabeth, is seeing the decline in religious participations across different kinds of faiths, different kinds of participation, that there's a very serious decline. In that environment, how do we still make the case that people should be supportive of religious freedom?
Do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think one part of it is to recognize that religious freedom is for everyone. It's not just for people who are believers. It's not just for Christians. Religious freedom opens a space where people can make choices about things that are very dear to their heart and very close to their identity. And that includes people who choose not to believe or who are agnostic. So part of it is having a broad view of what religious freedom is. I think some of it is doing the kinds of work that John Griffith was talking about, where you try to reconcile liberty and equality claims, right? You show dignity, you show respect for people, even when you can't always agree, trying to find ways to agree, trying to find ways to show respect. And I think those can help sort of to build and make religious freedom less contentious.
I think I think those are excellent points, and I would add that, and maybe I'll even, well, let me start with my first point, is that one of the things I think that we could do better is helping people understand the nature of religious freedom claims. That I think there's an attempt to maybe caricature people who are saying I deserve protection of my religious practice as maybe having some kind of ulterior motive, but if we recognize that people believe they're accountable to God for their actions are really, really important, and we have to the degree we possibly can, make room for them to live out those convictions in their daily life. And I think if we could maybe pull some of the divisiveness that Judge Griffith was talking about out of that discussion and recognize that these people deserve the ability, some room to practice. Maybe related to that, I think we've, in the last decade or so, we've, I think, forgotten a little bit about who is making religious freedom claims. And we don't, I think if you were to ask many people what they sort of envision as a religious freedom conflict, right? With something that would go to court or the legislature would deal with. You would think in terms of the issues that Elizabeth mentioned, the things to do with abortion or sexuality or those kinds of subjects. But there are such a wide variety of claims that people are making that involve things like, I've used the example of the Amish, that they live out daily life in a way that's really different, but that's part of their religious beliefs, and those beliefs need protection as well, even if it looks very different from the way we typically think of practicing religion would be. Native American churches and many others deserve protections, and I think their interests in having religious liberty protected may be, to some degree, being lost sight of in the discussion about some of these high-profile issues that are, maybe easier to bring some division. But I know Elizabeth's done some amazing work on documenting some of the benefits that religion brings, and that may be another piece. I don't know if that may be where you're going.
Yeah. Let's jump into that, because we want to revisit kind of the critics or the skeptics, and in some cases some very understandable concerns. And as Judge Griffith mentions, sometimes when religion can be used to do harm. So we don't want to sort of end run around that. We want to acknowledge that. But first, let's dive into this idea of broad societal benefits of religion. And if you would, couch it as if you're making an argument to someone who does not have a theological grounding or a spiritual belief system, that you're essentially trying to convince them in the societal way, here are other benefits of religion that even if you aren't religious, the evidence speaks for itself. So Elizabeth, can we start with you, and then Bill, fill in the gaps?
Sure. No, I mean, this is just fascinating. I've done the research. I've just been overwhelmed. I mean, it just keeps coming. I mean, there's enormous individual benefits in terms of well-being, life satisfaction. There's increased physical, mental health. Religiosity helps people who live in underprivileged areas and reduces criminality. It creates more pro-social beliefs in prisons, among youth, increases educational benefits. I mean, and this is just the individual, and then there's family, right? Increases levels of marital satisfaction, reduction in verbal aggression with children, better self-reported parent-child relationships, so all these things. And that's not even looking at how it adds society. I mean, if you know Robert Putnam, who's sort of the founder of this whole idea of social capital, he said that the greatest repository of social capital in America is in its religious organizations, right? People bring this sense of community life, this trust, some of the bonds that have been fraying that we desperately need, reciprocity, this sense that we work together. And there are a lot of practical ways in which that work together has made a difference. I mean, 60% of all homeless shelter beds are supported and run by religious organizations. They educate over 3 million children a year, provide more international aid, 4.5 more times international aid than the Gates Foundation, right? I mean, I mean, I could go on and on, more than you want to hear. But I think that it's useful to think about these because you're right, not everybody is convinced by doctrinal or religious commitments, but I think there's ways to see that, yes, there are ways in which religion can be used to do harm, right? It's real, but the amount of good that religion, particularly institutionalized religion, does worldwide is phenomenal. So, I don't know.
That's super. It would be almost impossible to find holes in anything that Elizabeth's done, so I won't add to that. But in Sutherland, we've been trying to document this in a series of blog posts and things, trying to note some of the remarkable contributions that religion makes. So we looked, for instance, just as one interesting recent example, is that there was an article in the Deseret News, some of you probably saw, that about loneliness. We worry about loneliness because of the COVID pandemic and the remarkable unsettling that happened in that. And there was a notice. One of the things that was noted in this article, based on the study on youth and their feelings, was that those who are actively involved in religion are far less likely to feel that overwhelming loneliness that so many others report. And an interesting piece of this, and I think this goes to a point we were making earlier, that that's true because the article specifically looked at whether that would apply for LGBT youth as well as youth who are kind of what we think of as traditionally religious. And the answer is yes. Religion helps everybody, and there's lots of different kinds of religions. And so the more that I think is a piece of the discussion we're having that would really, I think, make a difference in terms of coming to some common understanding. The piece that sort of comes to my mind so often is that if we are willing to give a little bit in terms of allowing people to act on their beliefs, whether those beliefs are religious or not, and I think that the vast majority of people who are making claims for religious freedom really are willing to give a lot of space, notwithstanding what you occasionally will see. If that happens, then you'll see benefits that are felt widely, and our history tells us this. I mean, you think about the incredible contribution that people of faith made to movements like civil rights movement or abolitionism. I recently read a book about the forced sterilization, Adam Cohen's book. And there was only one organization in the country that was pushing back against that, and it was the Catholic Church. So when we worry about letting the Catholic Church have act on their beliefs as they provide social services, we are also missing a powerful moral voice that could make a difference and could shift the trajectory of our country's commitment to principles that we all eventually will recognize are critical. So I don't know if some of that's helpful, but.
I think it's great.
I want to drill down on something, and Elizabeth, you mentioned Robert Putnam and his work on social capital and the decline in some of our civic institutions. You've all lived in American Enterprise Institute has also done tremendous work on this. And churches and religion in general, churches, mosques, synagogues, this institution of religion being one of those key pillars of social capital. And the question I want to ask, I was in a conversation with a relative who we were talking about the concept of church, and he kind of half-jokingly said, well, my church is my CrossFit gym. I go there, I get a sense of community. The reason I bring that up is, can you kind of address, for somebody who might be thinking, okay, I can understand the associational benefits of participating in an organized religion. There's a sense of community, a sense of camaraderie. You have regular people you interact with in their community. That's a positive thing. But can't I get that somewhere else? Is there something different about a religiously oriented associational structure that makes it distinct from other associational structures that still have some of the same, mechanical components? Can you help kind of shed some light on some distinctions there, both on the individual level and expand a little on the community level, that what religion provides is fundamentally different than some of these other organizations that can still have tremendous benefit?
Sure, sorry.
Maybe I'll start with just some thoughts. Judge Griffith mentioned President Oaks. He made a very, I think, powerful insight. Shared a very powerful insight that, and I'm going to paraphrase, that sense of accountability for God as a motivation you don't see in other. We know that one of the primary players in foster care in the United States are religious groups. Just as one example. The government and many government officials do remarkable, they have a selfless approach to trying to help children in need. But there is a kind of a personalization and a warmth that comes when there's a religious motivation behind the provision of social services. And that sense of accountability, I think, motivates people to do things that we couldn't pay other people enough to do. We see that in families, a similar kind of thing. We're willing to do things for our families we wouldn't do for strangers. And religion, in some ways, maybe to go on that, religion in some ways helps us recognize we all are family to some degree, and so helps us do things we wouldn't otherwise do. So I think motivation would be one major piece of that.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think religions have, social scientists have looked at this and tried to figure out, well, why is it that religion has these benefits, right? If you attend a religious organization, even if you don't even believe the doctrine, but if you attend regularly, you're more likely to give philanthropically, right? Even to non-religious organizations than are people who don't. So what is it about this that does it? Is it just that people gather together, right, like a gym? And this is a real question. So many young people now, particularly millennials and younger, are not affiliating at a higher rate than others, and they don't see the value. But I think that when you understand that these norms that bring us together, right, that religion infuses us with norms, social commitment, sort of accountability to other people in the community, people who will reach out and care about you, the functioning as an institution is also really important. Religions play peace-building roles. They play social advocacy roles. These are things that a gym can't do, and help pass on norms among generations. There's just a lot of layers here. Which is not to say that religious organizations are perfect, and I think we always have to be careful of trying to, sound like we're painting too rosy a picture. But frankly, statistics are really phenomenal.
Yeah, compelling. I loved Judge Griffith's the quote about think that I often will say this to people: just consider that you might be wrong, and religion does that. Even if you hear someone else's faith claims and you think, well, I'm not convinced by that, or I don't feel convicted that that's true, those claims can be really, really important. And people who didn't recognize the drastic injustice that was being done to poor women by, goading or in some cases forcing them to be sterilized. they should have listened to religious voices who were saying this violates the dignity of human beings. And so having those voices out there is critical, even if we say, well, I don't really see it that way. But having that there is an important part of just sensitizing us to things we might not otherwise see.
That ties into something I think we can dive a little deeper into is that acknowledgement of when there have been harms done, or when there are controversies, or we think of the controversies that tend to generate news headlines on the national and local level. And can we expand on that a little bit? Help folks here who either are willing to be convinced of the importance of religious freedom or want to go out and be champions of religious freedom. How do we address that question specifically? And Judge Griffith mentioned some of this in his comments as well about the balance between equality and religious freedom. Issues of discrimination come up. So help us understand and think through the right way to address that in terms of our public policy, and the right way to address it just in our conversation and how we approach it with our fellow citizens.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that a lot of religious scholars have explained this in terms of, they call it the ambivalence of religion, that it can be used for good, that it can be used for bad, right? It can give us the norms we need to make a democracy flourish, but it's also been used to prop up totalitarian regimes over the years, right? There's an inherent ambiguity, which should keep us humble as religious people. And I think humility is sort of the root of both sort of public policy and individual relationships. But I think, public policy, both of them, it starts with having some empathy and acknowledgement, excuse me, of where other people are coming from. I think sexuality issues are difficult for many religious people to grasp, but I think if you think about it in terms of identity, what is core to our identity? And people have overlapping and multiple identities. And for some people, part of that identity that's core is their sexuality. And so having respect for that, even if that's not you or you don't agree with that at a fundamental level, being able to show respect and love and acknowledgement that this is real for them gives us a starting place. And I think Utah Compromise is sort of a political outworking of what happens when we have that kind of respect. It's not the only way that could happen, but the sense that other people's needs, even if I fundamentally disagree with them or they don't make sense to me, are important because I care about them as people. And if they care about this, then it's important to me too.
I agree, and I've heard recently some discussion in religious communities, and particularly among leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that I think is a really helpful way forward, and that is identifying what things are really core. I mean, there are things we may prefer to have happen, and they seem to generally be consistent with our religious beliefs, but aren't actually required. And understanding and sort of trying to explain to others. I've kind of been grinning a little bit when you mentioned CrossFit, because I wish that sometimes those of us with strong religious beliefs shared them as much as people with a tendency to be involved in CrossFit, right? That's or other kinds of interests. We're sometimes better about talking about our routine than we are about our beliefs. But if we help to explain to people what is core to what are some things that I really can't compromise on, then I often think, first of all, we'll find there's probably less than we realize. There are probably more things, just basic decency and kindness and civility and sincere respect for others are religious beliefs. It's very rare to find a religious group that has a belief that they ought to be unkind and belittling of other people. And so that may be a good start. And as we talk about that and express that and then say, yeah, there are some ways in which our understanding of the definition of marriage or the sanctity of life are different, then it's fine to talk about that. But always beginning with that starting point, I think, is a good way to begin the kinds of discussions Judge Griffith described. We could be a little more open about what we believe and why we believe it, and that probably could make a difference.
So to kind of bookend this, and I don't want to get too much into the legislation because our second panel is going to dive into that and talk about kind of the strategy around this from a public policy standpoint. But as defenders or practitioners or community advocates that recognize the benefit of religious freedom, what's kind of a good one or two talking points that we can use when we're trying to articulate the need for perhaps a legislative approach like the Utah Compromise that our second panel will get into those kinds of things in more detail, but just in the way we talk about it with our fellow citizens. And I'm curious if there's a way to frame it where it's not about trying to get a particular religion to change something that's doctrinally foundational to their faith, and it's not about trying to get a community to change something that's also foundational to them and their identity, as you've talked about, Elizabeth. So in that context, what's the best way to sort of bring those two groups together and say, we need to be able to find this common ground, the shared human dignity? Give us a couple talking points that we can tee up in those kinds of conversations.
Go ahead.
Well, I think one thing we say is we have more in common than we have in difference. We tend to focus on the difference. We tend to highlight it. That makes culture wars fun for people who like culture wars, I guess. But, I mean, there's a really great study that's done internationally that the average level of support for LGBTQ rights is 38% higher in countries with a high level of religious freedom than it is with countries with a low level of religious freedom, right? Rights come bundled together in most instances. And, you know, we have a common interest in liberty. We have a common interest in being treated with dignity and respect. We have a common interest in equality. I mean, we may not interpret all of those the same, but we do have things in common. And I think recognizing that and building on that is a really important place to start.
I think that's excellent. One thing that I've thought of is that if we could help people understand that as we increase the circumference of religious freedom, we increase the circumference of freedom for every person. This is maybe a quick story, a personal story, that when I was in high school, there was a girl in one of my classmates who, for ethical reasons, did not want to dissect a frog. And you know, it kind of became a little issue in the I won't tell you what decade, but it's some decades ago. You know, and the school was trying to decide whether to accommodate. But as you look back, she eventually was accommodated, and the reason was because people, including many people of faith, had stepped forward and asserted religious beliefs and asked for protection of those, and the protection of those increased the protection for other people too. You know, she's looking back to a series of cases that began with Jehovah's Witness students who were unwilling to salute the flag, and their rights were eventually, not initially, but eventually protected. And that spirit, as well as the specific law, benefited people who had no religious beliefs at all, but have important convictions that needed protection as well. So increasing the circumference of freedom for religious people increases it for everyone.
Well, and maybe if I can add, I think we tend to start thinking in terms of camps, and that's a culture war mindset. I mean, the truth is that polls show that 60% of LGBTQ individuals believe in God, right? This is not a us versus them. I mean, it's us together, we're all in this, and people have real concerns. I think another point that tends to get forgotten when we try to focus on sort of the culture war aspects is that this affects minorities. A lot of the people who dislike religious freedom are angry at how what they see Christian majorities acting. But religious freedom protects, you know, the Muslim girl who wants to wear a hijab when she does sports, as well as Christians or whoever, right? It's a principled line, and it's important because we care about, you know, the sort of the way scriptures say, the least of these. We care about people who are going to be harmed wherever they are and whoever they are.
Which I think is a great way for religious liberty advocates to always be thinking, is there some, I love the Beckett Fund, I don't know if it's a slogan, but I've heard it said that we protect every from Anglicans to Zoroastrians, but thinking, you know, I haven't necessarily had an issue related to wearing religious jewelry or a headscarf or something, but there's someone out there who has. The more we know about that and try and be sensitive to the degree we can accommodate those concerns as well, we're better off. I think Utah's a good example of that because we've tried, we could do better, I'm sure, but we tried to make some proactive efforts to recognize that it's not just the majority that is well known, whose beliefs are well known, but those whose beliefs are not well known, are especially deserving of protection, or in need of protection, I guess I should say.
So to kind of tie all this together, we said at the beginning we're going to give you some principles, some facts, some talking points to go out there and be champions for religious freedom in a more productive, collaborative kind of way. And just to kind of bookend all of this, what you both are saying, of course there are the religious freedom conflicts that generate news headlines, but there are ways to address those in a productive way, like the Utah Compromise. There are also the broad societal benefits of religion and religious freedom that you've articulated, and there's a tremendous body of research illustrating that in various aspects of life. And the point that we're kind of closing on is think of religious liberty as much broader than you currently do, that religious freedom encompasses all kinds of faith traditions, all kinds of participants of those religions, and if we can expand it in that way, that's the way to move it forward. So with kind of that framing as kind of the three big takeaways in our last minute, give us your 20-second most compelling final pitch to the audience so they can go out and be well-equipped defenders of religious liberty. Bill, we'll start with you, then close with you, Elizabeth.
It'll just take me 20 seconds to either way. Well, I think the key thing is that we should continue to assert. We do want to do so in a civil and appropriate way, but we need to continue to assert religious freedom claims. We need to ask to be respected in the private and public spheres, but we can do that in a way that's productive, and both are important. Both being civil in the way we do that and asserting the claims are both critical.
I'd say I'd focus on the fact that religious freedom is for everyone. It's for the believer and the unbeliever, the affiliated, the unaffiliated, that it not only gives a space for people to make choices on this really sensitive area, but sort of opens the floodgates for an enormous host of benefits that we all get as members of society.
Well, Elizabeth Clark, Bill Duncan, thank you so much for lending your time and expertise. Let's please give them a round of applause. Thank you.